The NTSB preliminary report is out on November 8930 November, the Cessna 310R that went down in Boca Raton, Florida on 11 April after an apparent flight control problem dealing with the rudder. Now, typically, preliminary reports don't tell us anything that we don't already know, but what they do break down in detail is the condition of the aircraft, the way they found it following the crash, and this is crucial information in this particular accident. My name is Juan Brown. You're watching the BLANCOLIRIO channel, and this video, like the others, is brought to you by viewers like you that support this channel here on Patreon. Thank you for your support. As you may recall, this Cessna 310 departed Boca Raton and immediately started doing left-hand turns, was unable to get the aircraft to stop making the left-hand turns in what appeared to be a rudder hard over to the left, and eventually crashed, killing all 3 people on board. This flight was the first flight after this aircraft came out of its annual maintenance inspection program. Every year at a minimum, a FAR Part 91 aircraft is required to have an annual maintenance inspection where we open up the aircraft and inspect everything. This is a picture of Harvey, the 310 that I used to own but have since sold because it's so much work to keep it properly maintained. At the end of each inspection or annual inspection, the aircraft is buttoned up and put back together, and the aircraft is put back into service with care being taken to put the aircraft back into service the way that it was found. Now, all of these flight controls on the aircraft are going to be operated, moved, and manipulated to their full travel, including all of the trim tabs. As the mechanics, we need to inspect all of the cables, check for any fraying or wear and tear on the flight controls, hinges, everything else. And in the process, we need to move all the trim tabs full control throw one way or the other so we can get to the cables and pulleys and chains and get them properly lubricated and check for their proper travel. And at the end of that process, we need to make sure that we put all of those controls back into a neutral condition. Now, the first flight after an annual inspection is a very dangerous proposition. You need to do, as the owner, operator, or whoever's going to fly this aircraft first, needs to do a very thorough pre-flight, making sure that the mechanics put everything back into a neutral position before flying the aircraft. And I highly recommend that you take this aircraft out on your own, solo, or with the mechanic, to do a proper test flight before you ever put your family back into the aircraft following heavy maintenance like an annual inspection. Now let's see what the NTSB found on November 8930 November, and a lot of the trick to reading these preliminary reports is having the ability to read between the lines what they're trying to tell you. The accident flight was the first flight after the airplane's annual inspection had been completed. And right away there were 3 folks on board the aircraft, and they were going to blast off from Boca Raton and head over to Tallahassee, Florida. A portion of the airplane's taxi and departure were captured by airport surveillance video. The video of the taxi revealed that the airplane made several left and right turns as it transitioned to the run-up area and runway. In other words, they were able to steer the aircraft just fine on the ground. In other words, they had enough rudder authority and nose wheel steering authority. Remember, the nose wheel steering is actuated by a couple of springs, spring-loaded cables off of the rudder control, off of the rudder pedals. So apparently on the ground, the aircraft was able to operate normally. The video of the airplane's takeoff revealed that the airplane maintained the center line of the runway during the takeoff roll. Again, they had good directional control of the aircraft during the initial part of the takeoff. Shortly after rotation, the airplane yawed to the left and continued in a left turn until the airplane went out of view. The airplane then momentarily re-entered the camera frame as it continued in a left yaw and a left turn. And then the aircraft began that subsequent series of left-hand turns. Audio from the videos were consistent with both engines operating. So both engines were operating fine, and at one point it looked like the pilot was attempting some asymmetric thrust in an effort to get the aircraft under control. According to preliminary ATC recordings, one of the pilots reported that they were having a problem with the airplane's rudder and that they could only make left turns. Now here's where they get into the condition of the aircraft. The wreckage was highly fragmented and there was a post-impact fire. The fuselage, including the cockpit, sustained significant thermal damage from the post-impact fire, and most of the fuselage and cockpit had been consumed. So it's going to be very hard to tell from this wreckage what went wrong. But all of the major components of the airplane were located at the accident site. So in other words, they located all four corners of the aircraft. Nothing appears to have fallen off of the aircraft prior to the crash. Now here's the important part. The airplane's rudder was found near the initial impact point and exhibited impact and thermal damage. The rudder trim tab remained attached to the rudder and was displayed minor impact damage. The flight control cable continuity for the right rudder, we'll get into the drawings of how this system works here in a minute. Flight control cable continuity for the right rudder was confirmed and was continuous from the rudder pedal attach point to the rudder bell crank attach bracket. However, the rudder bell crank attach bracket had separated from the rest of the bell crank. There were no visible signs of fretting between the rudder cable attach bracket and the rudder bell crank. So the NTSB is tasked with the formidable task of trying to determine, is all this damage they're reporting here a result of the impact, or did something break on this aircraft prior to impact? The fact that they made this statement here, and this will all be vetted out in the final report, that there was no visible signs of fretting between the rudder cable attach bracket and the rudder bell crank, indicates to me that they are thinking that this was a clean break associated with the impact of the crash. Fretting would indicate wear over time, that possibly this part could have broken before the crash if there was fretting. That's the way I read this. Because if the right rudder cable was broken, then that would certainly explain the left rudder hard over situation, or at least an inability to recover the aircraft to a straight and level flight. So I got the 310R maintenance manual out here to show you. Here's the rudder cables working their way back to the rudder bell crank right here. Here is the rudder bell crank, and here is what I believe they are calling the attach bracket. Let's see, it would be on the right one, located right here. So this rudder bell crank attaches to this torque tube, which is located on the bottom of the rudder and thus turns the rudder. The rudder cables attach here and here. Here's another view of the rudder cable assembly up at the rudder pedals, where the rudder cables connect to the rudder pedals and then proceed back towards the rudder after passing through a series of pulleys. Here's another view of the rudder bell crank assembly, the rudder cables attaching here with these cable links, and the what I believe they're calling the attach brackets in the report located here. And here's the torque tube of the rudder. A quick Google search on eBay finds a 310R rudder bell crank for sale here for $288, and here is what I believe they are calling the attach bracket to the bell crank, and it is fastened to this bell crank with no less than 6 solid rivets. And here's the flip side of it. So I believe this is what they are saying they found separated from the aircraft without fretting. There was no fretting in between these two surfaces here that would have indicated a prior problem. By the way, this is just an example bell crank. This is not one from the accident aircraft or has anything to do with this particular accident. Okay, now let's go on to the left rudder cable. The left rudder cable was fractured near the rudder pedal attach point and at the rudder bell crank. The separated cable ends exhibited a splayed, broom-strawed appearance consistent with tension overload separation. Both cables were attached to their correct installation locations. So the cables were attached correctly, but they had failed, and this tension overload separation is part of the impact damage from the crash. And right over here specifically is a good reference to what they mean by broom straw appearance. When you bust these cables apart under a sudden impact, the ends of the cable are just going to come apart like that. And while we're inspecting these aircraft, we're looking very carefully for any signs of failure of the cable like this, and you're doing it with a rag and a glove, carefully sliding along the rudder cable to see if there's any snags, if there's any bits of that cable that are beginning to fray. And then, of course, you've got to check the cables for wear and tear like this, as well as the pulleys using this example here. Then you've got to check and make sure all the safety wire is there and all the wires, cables, and pulleys. So it's a very extensive inspection that's done every year on every airplane. Okay, now so far, to me, it sounds like investigators are saying that everything they've found with the aircraft is a result of the impact of the crash. But here's the real kicker. The rudder trim actuator remained attached to the vertical stabilizer, and the rudder trim chain remained attached to the actuator's sprocket. The rudder trim rod end extension was measured to be 1.5 inches, which corresponded to 21 degrees trim tab trailing edge right, or in other words, full left rudder trim. If we look at the manual, I'll show you that 20 degrees to the left is full left rudder trim. Both rudder cables were fractured in the cockpit consistent with tension overload, so those cables also broke as a result of the crash. But they found the trim tab over in the full left rudder condition. So, was the pilot fighting a full left rudder trim position of the rudder trim and never thought to move the rudder trim back to the right, or at least to the neutral position? Or by some odd measure was somehow the rudder trim found in the full left rudder position as a result of the crash? I find that unlikely. Investigators found the elevator trim tab at 11 degrees trim tab trailing edge up, in other words, 11 degrees of elevator down trim, and the aileron trim to be full right aileron trim. So was the pilot struggling to regain control of the aircraft by simply using the aileron trim, and did he fail to use the rudder trim in an effort to straighten out this aircraft? Did this aircraft take off with the rudder trim and the full left rudder trimmed condition? And did the pilot fail to realize that and address this issue? Here's a view of an example of a 310R cockpit, not the accident aircraft. And here's the layout of these various trim controls. The elevator trim manual is located right here. The aileron trim is located right down here, and the rudder trim is located tucked under the shelf right here. And there's the rudder trim indicator, nose left and nose right. Here's an example of the rudder trim rod. This is on a 414. So this is the rudder trim here, and here's the rod. And this rod is actuated by cables to chains to a little pulley. So it's unlikely for this rod condition to be changed much by the impact of the aircraft. Here's a closer look at the rudder trim assembly. Here's the rod located out here on the rudder. Here's the rudder trim control wheel, which is mounted horizontally right near the throttle quadrant of the aircraft. Here's the chain and sprocket that actuates this little torque tube here, a chain and sprocket which actuates the trim cables, which go all the way back to the rudder, and they come up to here to actuate another set of pulleys and cables which screw in and out the actuator rod itself. So again, it's unlikely for this rod condition to change as a result of the impact of the aircraft. Even after these cables are broken by the impact of the crash. So they go on to explain the condition of the engines, but basically found that it appeared that both engines were operating normally and the wreckage was retained for further examination. So investigators are going to have to determine, was there anything broken with this rudder control system prior to the aircraft taking flight, or was it simply the fact that the rudder trim was put over in the full left rudder position and that rudder trim position was not captured by the pilot in a timely fashion that led to this crash? You got to do these pre-flights very carefully after these maintenance flights or maintenance inspections. And for goodness sakes, don't put your whole family in the aircraft right after the annual inspection. Go test fly the aircraft yourself first after the annual inspection before you put anybody else on board that aircraft. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.